This morning, I gave my son-in-law the combination to the old floor, safe in my workshop. I told him he could find everything he wanted inside, all my financial documents, stock certificates, and the deed to the house. He thinks he's just one step away from taking control of my entire life's work. But he's wrong. What he's about to find isn't a fortune. It's a reckoning, meticulously documented in my late wife's elegant handwriting. To understand why I set this trap, you need to know how we got here. It's a story about a father's love, a daughter's misplaced trust, and a son-in-law whose greed was a quiet poison that I mistook for ambition. It's not an easy story to tell, but it's one I feel I have to share. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions about this story in the comments. For 5 years, he saw me as a simple solution to his financial problems. He is about to learn that this old man built the very ground he stands on, and I'm ready to take it all back. Before that cold Tuesday in November, my life was built on a foundation of quiet routines. The days were measured by the sun slanting through the windows of my workshop, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny golden spirits. That workshop was my sanctuary, the place where the scent of cedar and pine was a kind of incense, and the hum of the lathe was my meditation. Eleanor used to say I could solve any problem in the world with a block of wood and a sharp chisel. After she passed 5 years ago, I found she was right. The work kept my hands busy and my mind from wandering into the vast, empty spaces she'd left behind. I remember one afternoon just before everything changed, I was sanding down a small rocking horse. The wood was smooth as silk under my calloused fingertips. I was making it for a grandchild I hoped to have one day. The light caught the deep grain of the cherry wood, and for a moment I was transported back to the day Eleanor and I picked out the floorboards for our living room. She'd run her hand over a plank of oak, just like this, and said, "This one, Arthur. This one has character. It's seen things." Our whole house was like that. A collection of stories held together by nails and love. Every scratch on the floor, every chip in the paint was a memory. The faint scorch mark on the mantelpiece was from the Christmas of 1999, when a 7-year-old Clara got too close with a candle, her eyes wide with wonder. My week revolved around Sunday. That was the day the silence of the house was broken by the sound of Clara's car pulling into the driveway. The crunch of tires on gravel was the starting bell for the only part of the week that truly mattered. She would come through the door, her laugh filling the rooms, followed by Mark, always a step behind, carrying a bottle of wine he'd insist on opening. He had a way of making himself at home that always felt slightly rehearsed, his hand resting on my shoulder a little too firmly, his smile a little too wide. "Arthur, you're a lifesaver," he'd say every single time, referring to some small favor or another. Back then, I took it as gratitude. We'd sit around the old oak dining table, the one I built for Eleanor as a wedding gift. It was scarred with decades of family dinners, homework sessions, and late-night conversations. The smell of my pot roast, slow-cooked for 6 hours just the way Clara liked it, would fill the air. I lived for those moments. I'd watch my daughter, seeing her mother's smile in her eyes, and feel a profound sense of peace. I had done my job. She was happy, she was safe. And Mark? He was part of that. When he spoke about his tech startup, his eyes would gleam with ambition. I saw a young man trying to build a future for my daughter, and I wanted to help. That's why I didn't hesitate. When they were struggling with the down payment for their house, a sprawling 2-story with a yard bigger than they knew what to do with, I wrote them a check for $25,000 on May 10, 2018. I remember the exact date because it was Eleanor's birthday. It felt like a gift from both of us. Then, nearly 2 years later, on January 22, 2020, Mark came to me, his face etched with worry. His business needed a capital injection to survive. He needed $60,000. It was the money Eleanor and I had saved for a trip to Italy, a trip we never got to take. I looked at Clara, saw the hope in her face, and I signed the check. I wasn't investing in a business, I was investing in my daughter's happiness. Mark promised to pay it all back within 3 years, with interest. He called me his rock. Even then, there were small things, little dissonances in the melody of our lives. I'd noticed Mark's new watch, a sleek silver thing that must have cost a fortune, Or hear him talking on the phone in the other room, his voice sharp and demanding in a way I never heard when he spoke to me. Once he made a joke about my old pickup truck, calling it a dinosaur. Clara laughed, a little too quickly, and changed the subject. I dismissed it all as the impatience of youth, the friction of a different generation. I wanted to believe in the family I saw gathered around my table on Sundays. Every evening, after the dishes were done and the house was quiet again, I would sit on the porch in the rocking chair Eleanor had loved. It was made of worn, weathered oak that had held her for countless evenings as we watched the fireflies rise from the fields. The gentle creak of the runners was a familiar rhythm, a lullaby for a life I thought was settled. I'd sit there, smelling the night-blooming jasmine she'd planted by the steps, and feel a deep, abiding contentment. I believed I was the luckiest man alive, watching over the legacy of love Eleanor and I had built. I had no idea I was sitting on the edge of a cliff, and the ground beneath me was about to give way. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't a thunderclap, it was a subtle shift in the air, like the pressure drop before a storm. The Sunday dinners, once the anchor of my week, started to feel different. The laughter felt a little thinner, the silences a little longer. It began with small comments, like pebbles tossed into a calm pond, the ripples spreading wider than I initially realized. One Sunday as we were clearing the table, Mark looked out the window at my old Ford F-150, the one I'd had for 20 years. It was dented and scratched, but it had never failed me. It had hauled the lumber for this house, brought Clara home from the hospital, and carried Eleanor and me on countless trips to the hardware store. "Arthur, seriously, when are you going to get rid of that relic?" Mark said, a dismissive wave of his hand. "It's an embarrassment. Clara and I could help you find a nice, reliable sedan. Something more fitting for a man of your age." Clara, who was stacking plates, froze for a fraction of a second. "Mark, Dad loves that truck," she said, her voice a little too bright. I just smiled and shook my head, saying something about how it still ran fine. But the word embarrassment hung in the air, heavy and metallic. He wasn't just talking about a truck. He was talking about my life, my choices, my very identity, and labeling it as something to be ashamed of and discarded. I looked at Clara, hoping to see a flicker of defiance in her eyes, but she was already looking down, her focus entirely on the dishes. A few weeks later, Mark followed me out to the workshop. He'd never shown any interest in my work before, always referring to it as my hobby. He stood in the doorway, his expensive leather shoes looking comically out of place on the sawdust-covered floor. The air was thick, with the rich, earthy scent of freshly cut oak. He ran a hand over a stack of lumber, then wiped the dust from his fingers with a look of distaste. "You know, Arthur, this is a lot of space," he said, his eyes scanning the room. He wasn't seeing the bandsaw where I'd spent hundreds of hours, or the workbench that bore the scars of 3 decades of creation. He was calculating square footage. "This workshop sits on prime real estate. If you ever decided to sell, you could clear a pretty penny. Or we could even look into converting it into a rental unit. Passive income, you know?" I stopped sanding the piece of maple in my hands. The hum of the workshop suddenly felt very quiet. "This is where I work, Mark," I said, my voice even. "It's not for sale, it's not for rent." He gave a condescending little chuckle. Of course. Just thinking ahead. Always have to be thinking about maximizing assets." He clapped me on the shoulder, that same firm, proprietary gesture. It no longer felt like affection. It felt like an appraisal. He was looking at my sanctuary, a place filled with the ghosts of my happiest memories with Eleanor, and seeing only a $sign. The final crack appeared about a month after that. The subject of the $60,000 loan came up. I had mentioned, gently, that the 3-year mark he'd promised for repayment was approaching. We were in the living room, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. Mark leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Arthur, about that," he began, his voice dropping to a confidential tone, "I see that money less as a loan and more as your foundational investment in our future. And now, we're ready for phase 2. He launched into a pitch about a new server upgrade his company needed, something about scaling operations. He was using jargon I didn't understand, but the final number was crystal clear. He needed another $15,000. It wasn't a request. It was an expectation. He didn't even mention the first sum. It had been absorbed, forgotten, reclassified as a gift I had apparently already agreed to. "Mark, a loan is a loan," I said, my voice calm but firm. "We had an agreement. And we're honoring it by making the business a success," he countered, a hint of impatience in his tone. "You have to spend money to make money. Don't you want to see Clara secure for the rest of her life?" He'd put her between us. A shield. I looked at my daughter, who was sitting on the sofa, twisting a loose thread on a cushion. She wouldn't meet my eyes. In that moment, I saw it all with a terrible clarity. The truck, the workshop, the money. They were all pieces of the same puzzle. In Mark's eyes, I was not a father. I was a resource. An asset to be managed, maximized, and eventually liquidated. That evening, as I sat alone on the porch, the creak of Eleanor's rocking chair sounded like a warning. The quiet contentment was gone, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. The foundation of my life wasn't just cracked, it was beginning to crumble. The dam broke on a Tuesday. Not with a roar, but with a quiet, sickening crack. Mark came over that afternoon, alone. He didn't call first. The sound of his Tesla gliding silently up the driveway was the only warning I had. He walked into the kitchen, carrying the same sleek leather briefcase, setting it on the table with a soft thud that echoed in the silent house. The scent of his expensive cologne, sharp and chemical, invaded the familiar smell of lemon oil and old wood. He looked at me, his smile tight and impatient. He had given me a week to think, and his time was up. "Arthur," he began, his voice smooth, the kind a salesman uses when he thinks the deal is closed. "I hope you've come to a sensible decision. Clara's been worried." I was sitting at the table, my hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm coffee. I looked from his face to the briefcase, then back again. I had spent the last few days with Eleanor's ledger. Her handwriting was a ghost on the page, each entry a testament to a truth I had refused to see. The numbers didn't lie. $25,000, $60,000, another $4, $300 for a car repair, a dozen smaller amounts, all meticulously noted. I wasn't just looking at a son-in-law anymore. I was looking at a predator who had been feeding on my family for years. "I have been thinking, Mark," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I was thinking about the $60,000 I gave you for your business. The loan you were going to pay back by January of this year." The smile vanished from his face. It was instantaneous, like a mask being dropped. A flicker of annoyance crossed his features before being replaced by a look of profound condescension. He sighed, a theatrical, put upon sound, and leaned his hands on the table. "Arthur, we've been over this. That was seed money, an investment in your daughter's future. Are you really going to start nickel and diming us now, at your age?" The words hung in the air between us. At my age. He said it like it was a diagnosis, a terminal condition that disqualified me from having a memory or a right to my own money. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't move. I just watched him. My silence seemed to infuriate him more than any argument could have. He pushed himself away from the table and began to pace the kitchen, his polished shoes clicking on the linoleum floor. Eleanor and I had laid one weekend in the summer of '87. "This is exactly why we need the power of attorney," he said, his voice rising. "You're getting sentimental about things. You're losing track. We can't have your life's savings just sitting in some low-yield account because you're too afraid to make a move. This house, this property, it's an asset, not a museum. It's bleeding money." He stopped and turned to face me, his hands on his hips. His eyes swept the room, not seeing the place where my daughter took her first steps, but seeing peeling paint and outdated appliances. He was appraising my life for demolition. "Frankly, it's becoming a burden," he said, the words sharp and cold as ice picks. "Clara and I, we have our own lives, our own future to build. We can't spend all our time worrying if you've paid the electric bill or if you're going to give your money away to some telemarketer. Clara agrees, you know. She's just too soft-hearted to say it to your face. She doesn't want to hurt you." He stepped closer, leaning down until his face was just a few feet from mine. The practiced charm was gone, replaced by raw, undisguised greed. "It's time to be practical. You've had your run, you built a nice little life here, now it's our turn. Just sign the papers, Arthur. Let us manage things. Let us take this weight off your shoulders. It's time for you to step aside and let the people who know what they're doing take over." I just stared at him. I felt nothing. The pain, the shock, the anger, it had all burned away in the preceding days, leaving behind something hard and clear. In that moment, he wasn't family. He was a problem to be solved. He had just confirmed every entry in Eleanor's ledger. He had just confessed to everything without realizing it. He mistook my silence for submission. A smirk played on his lips. He slid the thick stack of papers from his briefcase and placed them in front of me, tapping the signature line with his manicured finger. "Do the right thing, Arthur, for Clara." I didn't look at the papers. I looked past him, through the kitchen window, to the old oak tree in the backyard. Eleanor and I had planted it from a sapling the year Clara was born. It was tall and strong, its roots running deep into the earth. They thought my roots were shallow. They thought I was a dying plant they could simply pull from the soil. They were wrong. I finally met his gaze. "Leave the papers," I said, my voice a dead calm. "I'll think about it." He smiled, a victor's smile. "I knew you'd see reason." He clapped me on the shoulder, the gesture feeling like a brand. Then he turned and walked out. The sound of his car door closing, followed by the faint hum of the electric engine as he disappeared down the road. I sat there in the silence, the papers lying on the table like a declaration of war. My thinking was over. It was time to act. As the sound of Mark's car faded into the distance, I remained at the kitchen table. The silence he left behind was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with a strange, cold clarity. I looked down at the stack of papers he had left. The durable power of attorney on top. His neat, yellow, sticky note still pointing to the signature line like an accusatory finger. There was no fire in my chest, no tremor in my hands. The hurricane of betrayal and grief had passed, and in its wake, the landscape of my life was laid bare, stark and clear. Every word he had said, "burden," "at your age," "step aside," was no longer an insult. They were tools. And I, a man who had spent his life with tools, knew exactly what to do with them. I picked up the papers. They felt weightless, insignificant. I didn't rip them. I didn't crumple them. I simply squared the edges with a tap on the oak table and set them aside. My movements were slow, deliberate. I rinsed my coffee mug, the sound of the water echoing in the quiet room, and placed it in the dish rack to dry. Then I walked out of the house, leaving the scent of Mark's cologne behind, and went to my workshop. The moment I crossed the threshold, the familiar smell of cedar and machine oil felt like coming home to myself. The air was cool and still, filled with the ghosts of finished projects and the promise of new ones. This was my space. A place of logic, of measurement, of things fitting together exactly as they should. On the workbench, next to a half-finished wooden bowl, lay Eleanor's ledger. I ran my hand over the worn leather cover. It was her final gift to me. Not just a record of debts, but a map of Mark's character. I opened it, her perfect script, a silent testimony to the truth. She had seen him. She had known. I looked from the pages of the ledger to my tools hanging neatly on the wall. The chisels, the saws, the planes. Each one was designed for a specific purpose, to cut, to shape, to join. A plan began to form in my mind, not as a flash of anger, but as a carefully constructed design, like a blueprint for a piece of furniture. It was a plan built on Mark's own greed and arrogance. He saw me as a relic, a sentimental old fool whose assets were ripe for the picking. That underestimation was now my sharpest tool. My gaze fell upon the corner of the workshop, to the heavy gray square of steel set into the concrete floor, the old safe. Mark had asked about it once, his curiosity barely veiled. I had told him it was where I kept old family documents. He thinks my mind is failing. He thinks my world is shrinking. He's about to find out he's wrong. They will not see this coming. Not in a million years. He's so focused on what he believes is inside that safe, so blinded by his vision of my money, that he'll walk right into the trap, convinced he's the smartest man in the room. I picked up a block of maple, its surface smooth and cool to the touch. The project I was about to undertake wouldn't be built with wood, but it would require all the patience and precision of my craft. And when it was finished, it would be a masterpiece of justice. The morning after Mark's visit, I woke before the sun. The house was still cloaked in the deep blue of pre-dawn, but for the first time in 5 years, it didn't feel empty. It felt like a command center. I walked into the kitchen and saw the power of attorney papers still sitting on the table, a monument to Mark's arrogance. I picked them up, not with anger, but with a kind of detached curiosity. I saw them for what they were, a blueprint of his greed. I didn't tear them up. Instead, I slid them into a folder, the first piece of evidence in a case I was building myself. My first call was at 8:01 a.m., precisely 1 minute after the law offices of Henderson and Crow opened. James Henderson had been a friend of Eleanor's father, a man with a reputation for being as unmovable as the granite of the courthouse steps. His voice on the phone was exactly as I remembered from decades ago, a low, gravelly rumble. I didn't waste time. "James," I said, "it's Arthur Miller. I need to see you. It's about Eleanor's estate." I was in his office by 10 o'clock. The room smelled of old leather and paper, a scent of permanence and order. I placed Eleanor's ledger on his vast mahogany desk. He put on his reading glasses and opened it, his thick fingers tracing her elegant script. He read for a full 10 minutes in complete silence, the only sound the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. When he finally looked up, his expression was grim. "Arthur, this is meticulous," he said, his voice soft. "This isn't just a diary. It's a legal document in its own right. It shows intent, especially this $60,000 entry for the business." He took a legal pad and a pen. "With a conservative 5% annual interest, compounded over the last 3 years and 10 months, Mark owes you precisely $72,854.19 on that loan alone. Adding in the other documented amounts, the total comes to $98,421.50. We'll draft a formal demand letter. It will give him 30 days to present a payment plan. If he fails to respond, we proceed with a lawsuit." I nodded. "Draft it," I said. "I'll let you know when to send it." I left his office with a copy of the letter in my briefcase, the weight of it feeling like the first solid step on a long road back. My next stop was the First National Bank downtown, a cold, imposing building with marble floors that clicked under my work boots. I didn't go to a teller. I had an appointment with the branch manager, a woman named Ms. Albright. I'd been banking there for 42 years. I sat across from her polished desk and explained my situation calmly and clearly. I didn't mention Mark by name. I simply stated that I was restructuring my finances to protect them for the future. An hour later, I had executed a series of transactions. I moved $450,000 from my personal savings and investment accounts into a newly established irrevocable trust, the Eleanor Miller Memorial Trust. The beneficiary was Clara, but the trustee was James Henderson, with me as the primary consultant. The funds could not be touched by anyone, for any reason, without a formal review process. I left my checking account with a balance of $5,000, enough for daily life, and set up an alert on my phone for any transaction over $200. I was building a fortress, brick by financial brick. That evening, I returned to my workshop. The air was cool, the scent of sawdust a comfort. I walked to the old floor safe, its steel face cold and impassive. I knelt, my knees cracking a little, and spun the dial. The tumblers clicked into place with a familiar, satisfying sound. I pulled the heavy door open. It was mostly empty, just as I'd told Mark. I began to prepare the stage. I took a stack of old, expired stock certificates from the 1980s and some tax returns from 1995 through 2001. They looked important, official. I placed them in a neat pile. On top of them, I laid Eleanor's ledger, open to the first page, where the $25,000 down payment was recorded in her beautiful, damning handwriting. And next to the ledger, I placed the sealed envelope from Henderson and Crow, addressed in stark black letters, Mr. Mark Peterson. Everything was in place. The trap was set. All it needed was the bait. I closed the heavy door, the sound of it locking, echoing like a final, decisive judgment. I walked back into the house and picked up the phone. I dialed Mark's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice sharp with impatience. "Arthur?" I took a breath and let it out as a long, weary sigh. I made my voice sound thin, tired, the voice of a defeated old man. "Mark," I said, "you were right. It's too much for me. I'm ready to sign the papers." I could almost hear the smile spreading across his face. There was a pause, and then his voice came back, dripping with false sympathy. "Arthur, I'm so glad you're seeing reason. It's for the best, you'll see." "I know," I said, letting my voice crack just a little. "Everything you'll need. The deeds, the stock certificates, all the financial papers. They're in the old safe in the workshop. The combination, it's Clara's birthday. The 6 digits, month, day, year. I let that sink in, the use of her birth date a final private piece of irony. You have my permission to go through it all. Just be careful with it. Of course, Arthur, don't you worry about a thing, he said, his voice brimming with triumph. We'll take care of everything from here. I hung up the phone without another word and stood in the silence of my kitchen. The game was in motion. He thought he was about to inherit a kingdom. He had no idea he was about to walk into a courtroom. If you liked this story, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments what you thought. I really want to know your opinion. Here you will always find stories that move, surprise, and bring lessons to take with you for life. The moment I hung up the phone, the silence in the kitchen felt different. It was no longer the oppressive quiet of a lonely house. It was the charged stillness of a chessboard after a decisive move has been made. I looked at the power of attorney papers Mark had left on the table. They seemed flimsy now, a cheap prop in a play he thought he was directing. I didn't tear them. I didn't burn them. I picked them up, squared the edges neatly, and slid them into a manila folder, labeled Peterson, 2023. They were no longer a threat. They were Exhibit A. My plan was already in motion, each step laid out in my mind with the precision of a dovetail joint. This would not be a victory of passion, but of process. The next morning, I was at the law offices of Henderson and Crow at 9 a.m. sharp. James Henderson, a man whose face seemed carved from the same oak as his desk, greeted me not with sympathy but with a firm, determined nod. He had Eleanor's ledger open in front of him. "Arthur," he rumbled, his voice like stones rolling downhill. "This is an ironclad record." Eleanor's meticulousness was her superpower. He slid a document across the desk. It was the formal demand letter we had discussed, printed on heavy cream-colored paper. It cited the initial loan of $60,000 from January 22, 2020, and calculated the interest at a standard rate of 5% per annum, compounded monthly. The total owed as of November 15, 2023, was a staggering $73,112.48. The letter also listed the $25,000 for the house and another $5, $250 in smaller documented loans, bringing the grand total demanded to $103, $362.48. Payment was to be made in full within 30 business days. "This is the first shot across the bow," James explained, steepling his fingers, "but we need to protect the fleet." He then walked me through the establishment of the Eleanor Miller Memorial Trust. It was an irrevocable trust, a legal entity designed to be a fortress. He explained it in simple terms I could understand. "Once your assets are in this trust, Arthur, they no longer belong to you in a personal capacity. They belong to the trust. A power of attorney gives someone control over your personal affairs, but it gives them zero authority over the assets of a separate legal entity." Mark could wave that paper around all day, and the bank wouldn't give him a dime from this. I felt a grim satisfaction. I was using the law, the very system Mark thought he could manipulate, to build a wall he couldn't see. We spent 2 hours signing the paperwork. I watched as James's paralegal stamped each page, creating the trust under file number T451EMM. It felt like I was forging armor. From the lawyer's office, I drove directly to the First National Bank. I bypassed the tellers and went straight to the office of the branch manager, Ms. Albright, a sharp woman in her 50s who had known me for years. I sat down and calmly explained that I was doing some late-in-life estate planning. I didn't need to give her the sordid details. The paperwork from James Henderson spoke for itself. My hands were steady as I signed the authorization for the wire transfer. I watched the numbers on the screen as she executed the transaction. Account number 78214459, my life savings, transferred the sum of $450,000 to account number 954311182, the newly opened business account for the Eleanor Miller Memorial Trust. The transfer was instantaneous. In the space of 30 seconds, the vast majority of my liquid wealth had vanished from Mark's reach. It was safe, protected by layers of legal firewalls. I left my personal checking account with a balance of exactly $4, $872.19, and I instructed Ms. Albright to place a mandatory phone call verification for any withdrawal over $500. She nodded, her expression one of quiet understanding. "A wise precaution, Mr. Miller," was all she said. That evening I returned to my workshop. The trap was legally and financially set. Now it was time to prepare the bait. I knelt before the old floor safe, the cold of the concrete seeping through my jeans. The combination, August 15th, 89, Clara's birthday, felt like a bitter betrayal to use, but it was a necessary part of the illusion. I spun the dial, the clicks echoing in the quiet space. With a heavy clunk, the locking bolts retracted, and I pulled the steel door open, revealing the dark, empty interior. I reached into a dusty filing cabinet and pulled out a handful of documents I'd saved for just this purpose. They looked impressive. Old, expired certificates for a company that had gone bankrupt in 1992, property tax assessments from the late 90s, a thick stapled copy of my 1987 federal tax return. They were worthless, but they were paper. They had weight. They looked like a fortune. I arranged them in a neat stack inside the safe. Then, I took out Eleanor's ledger. I ran my thumb over her name embossed on the cover. This was the heart of it all. I opened it to the very first page, where her perfect script detailed the $25,000 down payment for their house. The ink was slightly faded, a ghost testifying from the past. I placed the ledger right on top of the pile of useless papers. Finally, I took the crisp, sealed envelope from Henderson & Crow. The address, Mr. Mark Peterson, was typed in a severe, black font. It looked official, final. I leaned it against the ledger, ensuring it would be the first thing he saw. I looked at the arrangement one last time. It was a still life of his downfall, a monument to his own greed. With a deep breath, I swung the heavy steel door shut. The final, metallic boom of the bolts sliding into place was the most satisfying sound I had heard in years. The trap was armed. All that was left was for the rat to come for the cheese. 3 days passed. 3 days of profound, unbroken silence. I didn't get a single call. I spent the time in my workshop, the scent of pine shavings filling the air, the rhythmic scrape of my hand plane, a steady counterpoint to the storm I knew was gathering. I wasn't anxious. I felt a strange and powerful calm, the kind a sailor feels in the eye of a hurricane. I had charted my course, set my sails, and now I was simply waiting for the wind. The rocking horse I was carving for a grandchild I might never have was nearly finished, its wooden coat gleaming under a layer of oil. I ran my hand over its smooth, curved back. It was a solid thing, built to last. The wind arrived on Saturday morning, just as a cold November rain began to slick the asphalt of the driveway. Mark's Tesla didn't glide in this time. It screeched to a halt, the tires protesting on the wet gravel. I was in the kitchen, looking out the window, a mug of hot coffee warming my hands. The car door flew open, and he stormed out, not even waiting for Clara, who scrambled to catch up, her face pale and worried. He didn't knock. The kitchen door burst open, slamming against the wall with a crack that made the whole house shudder. He stood there, rain dripping from his expensive coat onto Eleanor's linoleum floor. In his hand, he clutched the demand letter from my lawyer, the paper crumpled and damp. His face was a mask of fury, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "What is this?" he spat, the words coming out in a choked hiss. He threw the letter onto the kitchen table. It landed next to the sugar bowl, a declaration of war on a domestic battlefield. "What kind of sick, twisted game are you playing, Arthur?" I took a slow sip of my coffee before setting the mug down. I didn't stand up. I just looked at him, my expression neutral. "It's not a game, Mark. It's a bill for services rendered." Clara came up behind him, her hand on his arm. "Dad, please," she said, her voice trembling. "Mark said you were confused. He said you found some old papers and got upset. We were just trying to help you organize things." "Is that what he told you?" I asked, my gaze shifting to my daughter. I saw the conflict in her eyes, the desperate desire to believe the man she loved over the father who had raised her. "Did he also tell you about the ledger? Your mother's ledger?" Mark's jaw tightened. "Don't you dare bring her into this. This is about you being senile and vindictive. You gave us that money. It was a gift for your family." "A gift is given freely, Mark," I said, my voice still quiet, but with an edge of steel he'd never heard before. "A loan, which is what Eleanor recorded for the $60,000, is expected to be repaid. The document number is L2020-01. The date was January 22nd. The terms were repayment within 3 years. You're almost a year late. He stared at me, momentarily speechless. The specific details, the cold, hard numbers, had cut through his rage. He had underestimated me completely. He thought he was dealing with a fuzzy-minded old man, not someone who had every date, every number committed to memory. He recovered quickly, his anger shifting into a sneering condescension. "This is insane," he scoffed, running a hand through his wet hair. "This is exactly why we need the power of attorney. You're clearly not capable of managing your own affairs. You're trying to destroy your own daughter's future over some imagined slight." He turned to Clara, his voice softening into a manipulative plea. "See, honey? This is what I was worried about. He's losing his grip." Clara looked at me, her eyes filling with tears. "Dad, why are you doing this to us? We're your family." That was the line, the one I had been waiting for. I finally stood up, my chair scraping softly on the floor. I walked over to the counter and picked up the manila folder labeled Peterson, 2023. I pulled out the power of attorney papers he had left and slid them across the table toward him. "You're right, Mark," I said calmly. "Perhaps you should manage things. Why don't you take this down to the bank on Monday? It's all signed and notarized, isn't it? Go ahead, try to access my accounts, try to pay my bills, see how far that document gets you." A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He saw no fear in my eyes, only a quiet, unshakable confidence. He couldn't understand it. In his world, that piece of paper was a key, and he couldn't fathom why I would hand it to him so willingly. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I planned for my future," I replied, echoing his own words back at him. "I protected my assets. Your power of attorney gives you authority over my personal accounts, Mark, and my personal accounts now contain a grand total of $4,872. The rest? Well, the rest is in a place you can never touch. It's in the Eleanor Miller Memorial Trust." The color drained from his face. He understood the word trust. He understood its finality. The arrogance, the anger, it all collapsed, replaced by the raw, ugly face of panic. He had walked into the hen house expecting a feast, and found the door had locked behind him, the farmer was holding an axe, and the hens were all gone. He just stood there, the crumpled letter in one hand, and the useless power of attorney in the other, as the rain beat a furious rhythm against the window. He was finally beginning to understand. This wasn't a game, it was a reckoning. Mark stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. The words, irrevocable trust, hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen from the room. They were a legal wall, a fortress of language he couldn't breach with charm or intimidation. His knuckles were white, where he gripped the useless power of attorney papers. For a long moment, the only sound was the drumming of the rain against the window pane, a frantic, angry rhythm. Clara looked from my face to her husband's, her own expression a canvas of confusion and dawning fear. She didn't understand the legal terms, but she understood the look on Mark's face. It was the look of a gambler who had just lost everything on the final turn of a card. He finally found his voice, a strangled, incredulous laugh. "You're lying," he hissed, pointing a trembling finger at me. You don't even know what that means. You're just an old man who plays with wood. You can't have done this. It's a trick." "There's no trick, Mark," I said, my voice as calm and steady as the old oak table between us. "I had excellent legal counsel. James Henderson, of Henderson & Crow. I believe you'll find his name on the letter you're holding. The trust was filed under document number T451EMM with the county clerk's office last Tuesday at 11:42 a.m. All my significant assets, including the deed to this house and the entirety of my investment portfolio, totaling $450,000, were transferred into it. As of that moment, they ceased to be my personal property. Your power of attorney gives you control over my personal checking account, which currently contains $4,872.19. You're welcome to it." Each detail was a nail hammered into the coffin of his scheme. The specificity, the dates, the exact figures, left no room for his blustering denials. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, gray pallor. His carefully constructed world was collapsing in on him, and he turned to the one person he thought he still controlled. He grabbed Clara's arm, his grip too tight. "Clara, listen to me," he pleaded, his voice shifting into a desperate, manipulative whine. "He's gone mad. Can't you see? He's been tricked by some shyster lawyer. He's given away our future, everything we've worked for. He's trying to cut you out, to leave you with nothing, because he's a bitter, lonely old man." Clara flinched at his touch, her eyes wide as she looked at me, searching for an answer. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. I didn't look at Mark. My focus was entirely on my daughter. "This was never about leaving you with nothing, Clara," I said gently. "This was about making sure you had something left after he was done. This wasn't about the money, it was about what he found in the safe." Mark froze. He knew what I meant. "You didn't find any stock certificates in there, did you, Mark?" I continued, my voice even. "No deeds, no bonds. Just a pile of worthless, expired papers from 30 years ago. And 2 other items. A letter from my lawyer, which you seem to be enjoying. And on top of it all, your mother's ledger." I saw the memory flash in his eyes, the moment of discovery, the shift from elation to cold, hard dread. I saw him opening that heavy steel door, expecting a treasure trove and finding instead a single leather-bound book that served as his indictment. Clara's head whipped around to face him. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place for her. "Mom's ledger?" she asked, her voice shaking with a new, terrible understanding. "The one she kept in her desk? Was it in there, Mark? Did you see it?" He couldn't answer. He just stared at her, his jaw working silently. His silence was a confession. "He saw it, Clara," I said, my voice filled with a sorrow that was deeper than any anger. He saw her handwriting. He saw the page where she recorded the $60,000 loan she never wanted me to give him. She saw him for exactly what he was. She knew. That was it, the final blow. The invocation of her mother's memory, her mother's wisdom, was a truth that Clara could not deny. The last vestiges of loyalty to her husband crumbled. Mark saw it in her eyes and finally, completely, lost control. "So what?" he snarled, his face contorting into an ugly sneer. "So she wrote it down in her little diary. It means nothing. We deserved that money. We earned it, putting up with you, with this dusty, falling-apart museum. You owed us that." Clara gasped and wrenched her arm from his grasp, stumbling back as if he had struck her. In that single, hateful sentence, he had confirmed everything. He had revealed the rotten core of his character, the contempt he held for me, for her mother, for the very life that had supported him. She looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time. The man she loved was gone, replaced by a greedy, cruel stranger. Her voice, when it came, was not a shout. It was a cold, quiet whisper that cut through the room with more force than any scream. "Get out!" Mark stared at her, stunned. "Clara!" "Get out of my father's house," she repeated, her voice gaining strength, her eyes flashing with a fire I hadn't seen since she was a teenager. "Now!" He looked from her resolute face to my impassive one. There was no escape, no angle left to play. He was utterly, completely defeated. Without another word, he threw the crumpled letter onto the floor, turned, and stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door behind him with such force that a picture on the wall rattled. We heard the roar of his Tesla's engine, no silent glide this time, as he sped away, spitting gravel across the lawn. The kitchen was silent again, but it was a different silence. The storm outside was passing, and in its wake, the air felt clean. Clara stood in the middle of the room, tears streaming down her face, but she was standing straight. She was free. In the ringing silence after the slam of the door, Clara and I just stood there. The rain outside was softening, its angry drumming on the roof slowing to a gentle patter. She finally sank into a chair at the kitchen table, the one Mark had just abandoned, and buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook with quiet, wrenching sobs. I didn't rush to comfort her. I just walked to the stove, put the kettle on, and made us both a cup of tea. The same way Eleanor used to when Clara would come home from school with a scraped knee or a bruised heart. I placed the steaming mug in front of her, my hand resting on her shoulder for just a moment. She looked up, her eyes red and raw with a pain that tore at my own heart. "I'm so sorry, Dad," she whispered. "I was so blind." I just shook my head. You wanted to believe in the good, I said. There's no shame in that. The weeks that followed were a quiet dismantling of a life built on lies. Mark, faced with a lawsuit he couldn't fight and with no access to the funds he had counted on, crumbled. He never fought the divorce. He and Clara sold the sprawling two-story house, its oversized rooms, a hollow monument to his greed. After the mortgage was settled, the remaining equity, a sum of $115,700, was transferred directly to the Eleanor Miller Memorial Trust, settling his debt to us in full. I never saw him again. The last I heard, he had moved 2 states away, his tech startup having folded just weeks after his financial pipeline, me, had been shut off for good. Life has found a new rhythm now, a quieter, more honest one. Sunday dinners have returned to the old oak table. It's just Clara and me. The silence isn't empty anymore. It's comfortable, filled with the easy understanding that only comes after a storm has been weathered together. We talk about her work at the local library, about the garden I'm planning for the spring, about memories of her mother. We are healing, one Sunday at a time. The house no longer feels like a fortress to be defended, but a home to be lived in. This evening I'm sitting out on the porch in Eleanor's old rocking chair. The November air is crisp and clean, and the sky is a deep, star-dusted velvet. For years after she passed, the gentle creak of the runners sounded like a lament, a lonely echo in a silent world. Tonight, it sounds different. It sounds like a heartbeat, steady, resilient, and peaceful. The scent of the night-blooming jasmine she planted is not a ghost of the past, but a promise of tomorrow. Clara came out a few minutes ago and sat on the steps, leaning her head against the railing. She watched me for a moment, a small, genuine smile on her face. The workshop is quiet these days, she said. I nodded. I finished the rocking horse. Her smile widened. Maybe one day, she said softly, it'll have someone to ride it. It wasn't a promise, just a possibility, and for the first time in a long time, the future felt like an open door instead of a locked one. I learned that my life's work wasn't an asset to be liquidated. It's a legacy of love and integrity. And that's a fortune no one can ever take away. If you liked this story, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments what you thought. I really want to know your opinion. Here you will always find stories that move, surprise, and bring lessons to take with you for life. Sitting here on the porch, the old rocking chair feels less like a memory of Eleanor and more like a throne I've reclaimed. Mark saw my life in dollars and cents, a collection of assets to be liquidated. He looked at my home, my workshop, my history, and only saw their market value. He never understood that a home isn't measured in square footage, but in the memories held within its walls, and a life's work isn't tallied on a balance sheet, but in the character you build. He thought my age was a weakness, a sign that my time was over. He was wrong. Age gives you a clarity that youth, in its rush for the future, often misses. It teaches you the profound difference between price and value. The greatest lesson in all of this is that your dignity has no price tag. It cannot be signed away with a power of attorney or stolen by greed. It's the one thing you build your entire life that is truly, untouchably yours. Don't ever let anyone convince you that your chapter is over. You hold the pen, and you alone get to write the ending. If you liked this story, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments what you thought. I really want to know your opinion. Here you will always find stories that move, surprise, and bring lessons to take with you for life.